The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. 360 Energy is a North American leader in energy and carbon reduction. Recently, we have launched the 360 Carbon Excellence Program, designed to make corporate climate change actions more effective and successful. For more information, check the link in our podcast description. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Hello, everyone.
Hi again. It's good to be back.
Seeing both of your smiles when we do the introduction makes my entire episode.
Oh, well, that's good.
You're always trying to change it up somewhat, because ever since the overlap, we're trying to change it up.
Yeah. It's a shame that people who just got the sound-only podcast don't get the benefit of our smile.
No, they don't. You're missing out, everyone. So today we're going to be talking about the road to net zero. And by that, we mean net zero carbon emissions. So I'm going to advise everyone listening that every time you hear the word carbon today, take a sip of your coffee because it's going to be quite a bit. We're going to be talking about no carbon, offsetting carbon, and storing carbon. And that is 3 different technologies or methods. So first, we're going to talk about carbon dioxide emission reduction. And this means carbon reduction is a process where an organization directly reduces greenhouse gas emissions through efficiencies in their organization. There's also carbon offsets, which is more so a trade-off, where companies get credit for funding external projects that reduce emissions. And there's carbon capture and storage, which is a process of capturing and storing carbon dioxide before it is released in the atmosphere. So basically, I want us to go through these technologies and answer a couple questions. And we'll start off with the carbon dioxide emission reduction. What is this method and how does it work?
Can I throw something in right away? Because this has been discussed before. Most clients will focus on carbon offsets. That's the first thing they do. Mm-hmm. And I think John and I have conveyed this in the numerous. That's the last thing you do. So I want to make sure the listeners understand that. Okay, so there's a variety of things that can be considered for carbon reduction. So there is actually reducing energy waste. If you recognize that 80% of the energy usage has an impact on carbon emissions, if you can reduce your energy usage and you reduce energy that you actually don't need to use. So you've got equipment operating, air compressors operating on a weekend, or a boiler, a standby boiler working, which doesn't need to be operating because it's the risk of it's not needed at all. Shutting that down, that's a reduction of carbon and carbon emissions. Then in our last podcast, and we've talked about this many times, there's energy efficiency, where you actually replace a piece of equipment that uses less energy but does the same job. So instead of using a 100 horsepower air compressor, you realize actually you only need a 50 horsepower compressor, and it does the same job, so it reduces the amount of kilowatt hours that are being used. And the same thing for, I should be using also natural gas. It's the same thing, boiler. Your boiler's oversized, and you don't need that type of size. So you have that. Then you have where you can switch, fuel switching. So instead of using natural gas, you end up using electricity. And so that's another form of carbon reduction. And then the last thing that I want to mention is that instead of buying, and which we talked in our another podcast, is that instead of buying from the grid, which may be deemed as dirty, I'm using that dirty word again, dirty energy, that you actually buy renewable energy to supplement or replace what's used in the grid. So there are a variety of things that can be considered in reducing your emissions. It just so happens no one really understands all those factors. They just rush because the easy thing to understand or do in their mind is to look at carbon offsets. So I just wanted to get that off my chest because I hear this all the time.
Yeah, you're right. That it's like we were talking about, energy. Kilowatt hour you don't use is a great one. That kilowatt hour that you don't use is carbon that you don't emit, or it helps reduce your costs. So all round, actually looking at should say one of the first things about carbon reduction is understanding what it is you do that generates the carbon, because that's then where you want to put your focus. And it's been quite interesting because I think in energy management terms, traditionally, we've always gone for electricity because that would be the more expensive and the biggest element of use. But in many jurisdictions now, electricity is cleaner than natural gas. So now we've got to look at the natural gas, maybe doing things with that. And as you said, the fuel switch scenario is a good one. There's a range of alternatives. It's the easiest one to do in as much that you shouldn't have to change too much about what you're doing. You can still do it within the framework of what you are. I think we should add to that as well, though. There is the one of, shall we say, the innovation one of looking at the process you've got or the product you make and saying, can we change that in such a way that we don't need so much energy to make it, or if we're making something that comes from a sort of carbon-based feedstock, can we do it an alternative way? So yeah, that works. It's a fairly straightforward approach. It's the old thing, use less.
And I if I could, I want to, because I always mess this up, and John must cringe when I say that, but 80% of carbon emissions comes from customers' energy usage. So I want to, I think I may have misstated that at the very beginning, but I wanted to make sure people understand.
You might have. The thing is that when you look at global carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions, there are a variety of things. There's energy, there's refrigerant, there's landfill, there's agriculture, and you've got all those bits and pieces there. But energy use, extraction and use is the biggest single piece of that pie.
This brings me to my next question. Who would most likely use carbon dioxide emission reduction as their pathway to net zero?
Everybody.
Everyone.
I think we leave it at that for that one.
Does that go on record as our shortest question and answer?
Oh, for sure. So what are some top benefits and major challenges with carbon dioxide emission reduction?
Well, the top benefits are you're going to get cost savings. You really are. And you can use a whole range of widely understood and accepted technologies. So that the major challenges are you need to do this in a structured, integrated way. And that we know from years of working in this space is actually a bigger challenge than many people might think that it is. But it's a solvable one.
Yeah, and it comes back to most clients really don't think of energy, understand energy, because they don't know that, they don't know where to start and how to do it. So as John said, once they have an appreciation of what that is and they put business processes to manage that, immediately there is an opportunity for cost savings, carbon emissions. And I think the other thing I want to say to our listeners is, yes, there's cost savings, but you're also going to find perhaps productivity improvements that will occur because of this focus. You'll probably see some health and safety issues. And we've also seen quality improvements being made because there's that lens that is being done within an organization. There's so many facets that most organizations haven't tracked or understood. And when they do put these management processes in place, because they'll be tracking this, they'll start seeing the benefits. So this is why I think we're, both John and I, are very passionate about this and have been for so many years, that it just makes great business sense. It's just business don't understand and don't have the infrastructure to measure this stuff historically.
Yeah, I think as well, one of the things I've seen is that there's been spin-offs. If you've had a really effective energy or carbon management approach, you sometimes get people within the business talking to each other who might not have talked to each other in the normal course of events, and this can actually lead to sort of secondary business improvements.
I actually think that out of the three, that this definitely is the cheapest one in my opinion. And I also think it's the most difficult in a way, because oftentimes organizations just want to purchase something and get it over with. They don't want to look internally and almost criticize how they're operating. And I think it's important to not look at it as a bad thing. If you're not being efficient now, that's okay as long as you're making those changes to become more and more efficient every single day.
I think you nailed it, Lysandra. Like in the energy thing, they just think it's a transaction versus a management activity.
Yep. All right, so our next technology slash method, whatever we want to call it, carbon offsets. What is this and how does it work?
Okay, well, the idea of a carbon offset is we imagine that, well, an analogy, the world is a swimming pool, the atmosphere is a swimming pool. And at one end, somebody's pouring water into this swimming pool. What we're looking at is somebody at the other end of the pool taking a bucket of water out so that we either keep the level the same or we reduce it. So a carbon offset doesn't have to occur in the same jurisdiction, location as the carbon emission. But the idea that what we're looking at is we balance one emission off against something that is absorbing carbon dioxide or taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The most commonly understood version of that is forestry, trees. And you will see very often that trees are used as a sort of a unit to measure amounts of carbon dioxide. It's a ridiculous measure. What kind of tree is it? How old is it? As they say, don't get me started on that one. But the principle is a sound one. It's the idea that we can have some kind of collective response, but it does rely on the fact that for everybody who is an emitter, that there's going to be somebody else who can do something that will take carbon out of the atmosphere. So consequently, we can't solve the entire problem, I don't think, with that. But as just describing the technology, that's the easiest way of looking at it. So we've got this swimming pool of carbon. Oh, this is all muddled up, isn't it? But yeah, some people refer to it as a bath. But I like the idea of a swimming pool because it's bigger. You can get the scale on it. And, we here, being dirty, are putting a bucket of carbon in, and we're hoping somebody else around the perimeter of the swimming pool is going to put a bucket in and take a bucket out. But what we do is we come to a commercial arrangement with the guy with the bucket at the other side, and we balance everything off.
I also want to remind our listeners that there's some podcasts that have been done in the past that have been described in detail, whether it's from John or from other parties. So if you need more explanation and understanding of that topic, there's lots of material to look at as well.
Next question. Who would be most likely to use carbon offsets as their way to net zero?
Everyone.
I think we can stretch this one out a little bit. I think with net zero, everyone is going to, but we have seen historically a number of people have used carbon offsetting, and I'm going to say for public relations purposes. There have been, and I'm not going to name them because that might be unfair, but there have been one or two rock bands that have, back in the day, do you remember there was a thing called a CD? when you bought a physical piece of music?
No, what's that?
Before streaming.
Oh, listen.
I can remember a particular group actually undertook to buy sufficient offsets that the making, the recording, the making and the distribution of that CD could be regarded as carbon neutral because they had bought offsets. And at that time, there wasn't really many other options about how they could make that carbon neutral. We also sometimes see public relations focused non-manufacturing organisations have limited scope perhaps to change what they're doing, and they may go for it. But until we've got some real step changes, I think everybody at some point for net zero may have to consider carbon offsetting.
Now, I personally think at this time right now, if a company is 100% relying on carbon offsets to offset their carbon emissions, I'm okay with that because some are doing 0%. However, I think in 10 years' time or in the future, an organization that uses 100% carbon emissions to offset their carbon is one that doesn't want to change. I think carbon offsets is a really easy way, again, because you're just purchasing something. But I think in 10 years' time, that if this is your only way to get to net zero carbon emissions, you're not looking deep enough.
I'm going to have a slightly contrary view, because you did say it's easy, and it is easy, but it's much harder to do it right. And here's the thing. Go back to my analogy, and we've got our swimming pool, and we're chucking a bucket in, and there's the guy the other side says he's taking the bucket out. How do you know that he's only taking out one bucket to match your bucket, and he isn't selling that bucket that he's taking out to 3 or 4 other people? That's one of the problems that starts coming when you start looking at offsetting. The other thing that comes in with offsetting is there has to be this notion, if we were not paying for it, the guy wouldn't be the other side of the swimming pool taking it out. You know, if somebody was going to plant a forest anyway, arguably that's not a true carbon offset, because if they were thinking of doing it without it being part of carbon, I know that one gets really, really difficult. Yep. And the other thing is that if you're buying a carbon offset, are you buying it for a year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever? Is it survivable? Is it good quality? We talk about, when we're talking about carbon offsetting, we talk about good quality, and it's quite a lengthy and complex explanation as to what good quality is. There was a recent study done, and somebody, perhaps people might, even after listening to the podcast, might go off and look for this, but somebody went and bought some carbon offsets through Google. Basically, they just Googled for carbon offsets and bought some. And then they went into depth into what they had bought. And it turned out that they were all, not all of them were talking about using the same units. And yet you should be using a common unit of kilograms or tons or whatever. So there was that. And then there were statements that basically said, oh, this carbon offset is a blended offset from a variety of sources. Couldn't name or track what those sources were. So you need an audit trail with a carbon offset. You need ideally to have it certified or verified by an independent, respected third party.
So it's got lots of challenges behind it. And then let's add market forces. What's going to happen as the world is driven towards zero emissions? What are the carbon offset costs going to be going forward? Is with the incremental demand, will the pricing go up, or will the supply increase? So those are all issues that need to be considered. What you see now may not be the price that you're going to pay in 5 years' time. So you want to be mindful of that.
And I'm just going to throw another one at you. This offset, we need to look at it through more than a carbon lens. Because are there other environmental, sustainability, social aspects to the offset? Because you might be buying an offset that's actually where somebody is destroying some other ecosystem to put in this offset. You know, you need to understand what it is you're buying. I may even have touched on this before, but I've come across recently the use of mangroves as an offset. And mangroves, they absorb carbon better than trees, unit for unit. They stabilize a coastline and they form a new ecosystem. So there's something where you're getting carbon offsetting and benefits, but you might not with others. We have to be careful, because there are a lot of respectable people with integrity out there in the carbon offset market who are doing their best. But there are some guys who are not playing the game squarely.
Those are a few major challenges already listed, but what are some top benefits for carbon offsets? I think I can just say carbon offsets, in my opinion, are better than doing nothing. So that's what I see as a benefit.
Yeah, you don't have to have a space to install them. You know, they can provide a fairly quick feel-good factor. But should you buy an offset if you could have actually reduced that carbon? Reducing that carbon, here's the thing as well, if you could get offsets for significantly lower cost than it costs you to reduce your carbon, I can see there is a business case. But all the time that it's cheaper, it may be harder, but if it's cheaper to reduce your energy, then you should be doing that rather than buying the offset.
I agree. I think I may seem very pro carbon offsets, and I would say I am in the short term if it's done correctly. John, you mentioned a few ways where it would be done incorrectly. I think carbon offsets are great if it's your only shot right now, or it's something you want to do now until you get those emission reductions or until you get other technology to help you reduce your carbon emissions.
Well, at the moment, if you're going to do air travel and you've got, let's say you can't not do the air travel, there's not much you can do about reducing the carbon emissions of an aircraft. Okay, we know they're looking into biofuels, electric planes, and somebody said, God, they need a long power lead for that. But, you know, we're looking at things like that, all seriousness. But at the moment, as an average person, if you've got to fly, let's say you've got to fly on business, because if it's holiday, we could say, oh, maybe you don't need to. But let's say you've got to fly on business and you want to do something about that. A carbon offset really is your only option.
And it tends to be simpler unless people evolve to actually
Yes.
create that transaction. So
Yes,
I mean, that's why organizations do it. And everything that we've said before, we're saying actually it should be everyone's job. And that's why people don't do it, because they don't actually understand that. So the offsets is far easier for them to do it.
All right, our last technology, carbon capture and storage. What is this and how does it work?
Okay. I was just thinking that Dave earlier on said, oh, carbon offsets are the last thing you should do. I'm beginning to wonder whether maybe carbon capture and storage is the last thing you should do. And I think,
John, you're right. No, you're right. For sure.
maybe the idea of carbon capture and storage, in simple terms, it's an end of pipe solution that you try to capture the carbon dioxide before it's been released into the atmosphere, and then you place it into some safe, durable, long-term storage. That's the simplest description we can give of it. One example of it could be for let's say a gas turbine generating station. The idea being that you collect all the exhaust gases and you take the carbon dioxide out of that, store it underground. You can then say that generating plant, although it's running on natural gas, is not emitting any CO2 into the atmosphere. So that's the simplistic approach to it.
And it's a big undertaking. This is not a simple task. It needs significant volume to make the economics work. It's from the investigation and research that we've done, and we've had webinars on this, and then we're going to have a guest talking about this. But from the past discussion, it takes literally 7 years to actually implement the grand scale of this. So this typically isn't set up for one site or one organization. It's to store significant amount of carbon. And so for people who are listeners, like there's gas storage in southwestern Ontario, which is significant, and it has to be to that scale where the amount of I don't know if it's even deemed as cubic meters, by the way. I don't know what measurement they use for carbon, but certainly it's a massive scale that has to be done. And so it's not, and it can't be used in all jurisdictions, because you have to have the geology to allow to pump this CO2 underground so it stays and doesn't leak in the environment. Otherwise, there's no value in doing that. So I know Canada has been doing, certainly I think in Saskatchewan, that there's some work that has gone on, I think with Shell for many years. They were piloting it. It was a very expensive endeavor. I think they've learned a lot, but I know Canada has deemed, and the federal government has deemed, as one of the critical pieces to our carbon emissions is carbon capture and storage. So, and in fact, they've now if you say incentive, there's a tax credit for organizations to undertake this. So there's jurisdictions like Alberta, which is prime area because obviously they've got oil and gas. They also have the geology to actually store this. So there's jurisdictions that are really focusing on this where it makes sense to do so. But it's a massive undertaking. And we had a webinar where a cement company in Norway. They were testing it's taken 7 years to get up and running. So this is not a quick fix, and John's right. This is a big undertaking. My understanding, and I'll stand to be corrected based on our podcast, but I think it's believed in North America to reduce our emissions, carbon capture and storage is like 10 to 20%. That's how important it is to achieve the emission reductions. That is a massive amount of storage. So it's a big undertaking, and you need a lot of players involved, sectors, possibly multi-sectors like cement and steel, combining efforts to actually plan this endeavor. It won't be a one typically organization that will do it. It will require lots of people to be involved.
So, Dave, would you say that the steel industry and the cement industry would be most likely to use carbon capture and storage as their road to net zero?
Yes, for sure. And I know there's discussions that are going on in the province of Ontario where they are actually looking at getting these parties involved and how CO2 could be captured and then stored in other locations in Ontario. So certainly, again, you have to have the proper geology to be able to do that. But it's just imagine trying to line that up and get people to buy into that. And it will need government involvement. It will need municipal involvement. It'll be a lot of people touching this. And certainly the society will need to be aware of it as well, because they'll need to have a buy-in in the whole process. Just like building a nuclear plant, there'll be a lot of people touching this thing to get involved.
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment. Who's going to use it? It's going to be a large emitter who is in a location where they have either got storage locally available or can connect to a pipeline that connects to storage. And the minute you start, I used a word there, didn't I? Pipeline. And, people have problems with pipelines the minute you start saying you're going to put a pipeline in. And we have to be aware, I think you're right, Dave. I think a number of jurisdictions say that when we're looking at the blended solution for climate change, carbon capture and storage has to be part of it. There will be those that are negative about it because they go, oh, it will just encourage people to continue using fossil fuels. I don't have that negativity about it. My negativity comes from the sheer scale of it.
That being said, what are the top benefits and major challenges with carbon capture and storage?
The top benefit is if you could have cost-effective carbon capture and storage, you can continue to use fossil fuels. And that is in the transition. That is quite important.
Yeah, that's key word, John. It's in the transition, right?
Yeah.
I think we've all discussed here that, as much as it would be like for the world to shut off oil and gas, like that's just not going to happen in the short term, or even possibly like 10 years, maybe 20 years. We don't have the infrastructure in place to do that. So that certainly it has to be used and considered in the long term. The challenge is, as I conveyed earlier, it's cost and length of time it takes to get it in place. And if you think about 2030, where some people are projecting that we need to have a 50% reduction, boy, that's a big technology we're relying on, and this won't be ready maybe by 2030. So it's a lot to put in, but it has to be considered for sure.
Yeah, can I say, I think another aspect that has to be considered, if we perfect and make cost effective the storage of carbon, there are those that then say we could look at just removing carbon from the atmosphere, not just from a process. I think as a technologist, yeah, that should be possible, shouldn't it? We should be able to just treat the planet as a big chemical plant, and we're going to process the atmosphere and, suck carbon dioxide out of it. Yeah, we should be able to do that. Not sure who's going to pay for it.
Yeah.
Tax dollars.
Yes.
Or if you happen to know the world's richest man who, having bought Twitter, feels that now wants another challenge.
Well,
hopefully he could help us out.
we know Bill Gates is on this.
Yes, he is.
There is some merit to it.
I think a major challenge at least to me, maybe I don't fully understand carbon capture and storage, but the atmosphere is so vast. How do we know that we're capturing 100% of those carbon emissions?
Well, when you're doing it on a plant, you're effectively piping the emissions straight into your carbon capture and storage. So, yes, it can work that way. If you were just sucking out of the atmosphere, your KPI would be the amount of CO2 that you got at the end of your process that you were putting into the ground. You'd be able to say, yes, we've removed the equivalent of a gigaton or whatever figures you want to throw at it. So there would be measurement at certain parts of the process, yes.
And then in
So
terms of like a leak, would they be measuring the atmosphere in general in a city or something to make sure?
Now you're touching on the point that I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
Would you know that? Well, the answer is you'd have to know that you had a leak. You would have to have quite sophisticated monitoring of the reservoir.
Right. Makes sense.
Yeah.
John, I want to pick up because it's kind of interesting, like taking CO2 from the atmosphere. So my understanding is I think we're like at 400 parts per million. I think.
It'll do as a working figure, yeah.
Yeah. But think of how much air you have to suck in to take out a kilogram of CO2 and the amount of energy it would take to suck in that air and then.
Oh, well, it's all right. It's all going to be renewable energy that we power it with. And that's the other point you've got to think about. That we're talking about a plant that will need to use energy. If we're not careful, we'll end up with a perpetual motion machine that's using fossil fuel to extract CO2. No, that is a joke. That is a joke. That's not going to be the thing. But you're right. It's like when people are saying electric vehicles. Oh, that's the solution. Electric vehicles are the source if they're powered by renewable electricity. They're the solution, not the source. So yeah, you've got to think of these things in the whole. I think the other concern is that CCS is still really an emergent technology. You could still say we're perhaps beyond proof of concept. We're certainly into a bit beyond prototyping, but are we at full-scale deployment? Not yet.
Yeah, I agree. And for our listeners, if you think about, if we talked about it earlier in the podcast, where renewable energy was for a cost point, 10 years ago and what it is now, the same type of thing will occur where the cost will start dropping because economies of scale and we'll learn things. So that will happen as well in this.
On that note, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners from today's episode?
I go with CCS isn't for everybody. It is probably going to be part of the global solution. And if you're interested in this area, it is a technology you should be tracking.
Yeah, I think, John, I'm completely in tune with what John's saying, so I'll just add a little more to it. If clients are waiting for carbon capture and storage to solve the problem, that's a big mistake. And if you're relying on carbon offsets in the short term that's another, like there's so much more that can be done in your organization with the proper knowledge base. And I'm saying in your organization, you don't need a lot of outside. This is stuff that can be done in organizations themselves.
Yeah, I would say not emitting carbon, offsetting carbon, and storing carbon are all going to play a role in the road to net zero carbon emissions. And I think that if you're listening to us for the first time or you're a regular listener, we do have episodes on carbon dioxide emission reduction, how you can make your organization more efficient. We have an episode on carbon offsets and carbon capture and storage, so keep an eye out. All right. Thank you, Dave and John, for your time today.
It's been a blast.
Thanks, everyone.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.